I want you to stay with me, Michael. I want to bring in a legal analyst known to our viewers, Maya Wiley, who's former counsel to the mayor of New York City, as well as Matt Miller, a former DOJ spokesman, and criminal defense attorney Ambrosio Rodriguez. But starting with Maya for Michael Avenatti, what do you think of his view of this, and do you have a question for him?
Well, I'd start with a question, which is, Mr. Avenatti, since your primary goal in zealously representing your client is that the NDA that she's been covered by is essentially ruled null and void by a court, that it has no legal premise, I'm just wondering how that actually attaches to the rest of the investigation that we're talking about. You've certainly been credible in the sense that what you've brought forward is borne fruit. But what exactly is Stephanie Clifford's interest beyond her ability to speak about an incident that happened to her with Donald Trump?
Well, I think our efforts have been clear in that they're focused on four primary goals. One, invalidation of the NDA on multiple grounds, including that it violated campaign finance, public policy, et cetera. That's number one. Number two, holding Mr. Cohen responsible for his defamatory statements regarding my client, seeking damages. Number three, holding Mr. Trump responsible for his defamatory statements against my client and seeking damages. And then fourth, an overall general belief that the truth and the evidence relating to Michael Cohen, his thuggish tactics, his intimidation tactics, and his business practices that are illegal should be borne out and laid bare for the American people. And I don't understand why people would criticize my client or me for bringing that information to light. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, people appear to appreciate it, including many journalists.
Michael, stay with me. Matt Miller, speak to that larger point, which does relate to the criminal culpability here that, as we've discussed, relates to several jurisdictions. And you can think of them as jurisdictions where Donald Trump could legally interfere and pardon, and those where he can't. And that's why tonight's news may be especially acute and scary, both for Michael Cohen, who, as I'm reporting, is facing now an individual who can cooperate against him, but also for Donald Trump, if he's seeing state charges bear fruit. With that in mind, Matt Miller, also speak to the point Mr. Avenatti raised, which is if there is a fusion here, if there is a kind of Stormy Daniels-ification of everything and a sloppiness to that, that is the product of Michael Cohen's decision to mingle these funds, to use the same essential consultant's secret account, and now to have a lot of folks digging into all that. Matt.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Look, on the first point, I've always been somewhat skeptical of the idea that it would be a joint investigation between the State Attorney General's office and Bob Mueller as a special counsel whose ultimate charge is investigating Russian interference in the election and whether any Americans took part of that. Whether some joint investigation in that regard would produce state charges, it seems to me that for the most part that's not within the State Attorney General's mandate. This separate matter into Michael Cohen is an entirely different question. If you look at the kind of exposure that Michael Cohen has, you can see, on the federal level, fraud charges, you can see potential tax charges, and on the state level, charges of violating state laws that appears his business partner did in terms of how he ran his taxi business. So this is a different area where I think you could see, very robust cooperation by state and federal investigators, where state investigators bring charges when it's appropriate and use that leverage to get him to flip in a federal case, or even vice versa. And you could see the Southern District of New York decline to bring charges and defer them to the state if they thought that was the most effective way, because it meant he was cabined off and couldn't be pardoned by the President of the United States.
Ambrosio, as a criminal defense attorney, what do you see here in this news?
Well, I think what happened today in Albany is a very bad turn of events for Mr. Cohen. He's been referred to as his business partner. This was really his mentor who brought him into the taxi business. He knows where everything is, and his cooperation with federal authorities against Michael Cohen, I think will expose Michael Cohen to such great criminal liability that it is just a matter of time before we start talking about Michael Cohen having flipped and turned on the president, which will be earth-shattering when that happens.
You think, based on your knowledge of the pressures, Ambrosio, you think, based on your knowledge of the pressures and the way this works, that is of what likelihood? 50-50, 80-20?
99-1. I mean, look at the deal that he got. I mean, he was 25 years per charge. He got, what, 5 years or something very de minimis. I think, look, as a former prosecutor and as a defense attorney now, I always look in a situation like this, what is the maximum exposure that a defendant is facing and what deal does he get. The kind of the chasm between his maximum and what he's getting shows you just how much information he has. Federal prosecutors make deals based on what you have and what you can give them.
Yeah. So let me turn to Michael
a
Avenatti on that point, a 99-1, and this comes from, as we mentioned, an independent analyst and a criminal defense expert. Listen, though, to Donnie Deutsch giving his recent assessment from primary source conversation with Michael Cohen about flipping.
Michael's words to me, he's loyal. He says, I'd rather jump out of a building than turn on Donald Trump. You know, he is fiercely, that might change over time, but he has this fierce loyalty that's almost inexplicable at this point.
Almost inexplicable to the point, Michael Avenatti, that, as you know, it has become something of a literal national joke with the Ben Stiller impression on SNL as Michael Cohen, inexplicably loyal. What in tonight's news, though, makes you so convinced that, and you've been saying for some time, that he will not withstand the pressure?
Well, Ari, a lot of criminal defendants take this position, and they state this unequivocally when they're immediately arrested or shortly before or after their arrest. And then reality starts to set in, and they begin to look at how serious the charges are and how serious the potential years and how many years, and they realize that they could likely die in prison if they don't flip or provide information. And you would be amazed at how quickly they soften and take a completely counter position. And I'm confident, highly confident, that that's ultimately what's going to happen with Michael Cohen. But I want to raise an issue that I think is very important for your viewers to understand and for people to start thinking about. If Michael Cohen is not careful, he's going to put himself on an island if the following is true. Now, Mr. Giuliani made a statement last week, and I don't believe a lot of what Mr. Giuliani says these days, frankly, but he made a statement that Mr. Mueller had made it known to, I believe, Mr. Giuliani or others, that Mr. Mueller does not believe a sitting president could be indicted federally. Now, if that's true, Mr. Cohen could have a significant problem, and that is that he could be charged with countless very serious criminal acts and be facing an enormous amount of time and not have anyone to flip on, not have the ability to trade information, in which case he could be in a very, very bad spot. Now, depending on what happens with these state charges, that might be different. But if Mr. Giuliani is to be believed, and if Mr. Cohen continues to take this position, as opposed to getting into the U.S. Attorney's Office like yesterday, and sitting down with them and beginning that dialogue, if he waits too long, the clock's going to run out, and he could be in a terrible spot.
And Maya Wiley, we have spent a significant balance of our time looking at the significance of this to what is an open criminal probe into the President of the United States regarding his potential obstruction on a week when he has been cracking down in very blatant ways on the Justice Department and on whether there was a conspiracy with a foreign power to effectively subvert American democracy, a.k.a. big stuff. But I would be remiss as the reporter of record here not to point out that, again, tonight we are also learning about the uncontroverted crimes of people in and around Donald Trump, even if he's absolved of the other stuff I just mentioned. In other words, if this were the Obama presidency and it was yet another individual, again, not presumed innocent, this is a plea deal. This is an acceptance of guilt. This is another person linked to the uppermost reaches of the Trump organization, Michael Cohen being an executive there, and the Trump's personal attorney of 10 years, who's now saying, oh, by the way, I'm a criminal too.
I think the question that this raises is whether or not there's a criminal enterprise. So I think that's what we don't know, right? So let me just be clear.
What do you mean, that there's a larger mob-style activity?
That's right. If you actually have... Now, we know that Michael Cohen has a lot of businesses, right? So it doesn't mean that any of the businesses may actually be the subject of criminal indictment or investigation or indictment are ones connected to the Trump organization. But that's a real question now. I think that this is something that we need to understand, and I'm sure that prosecutors are going to be trying to understand, is the connection connection between various forms of criminal activity. Just take 2014, where the New York Times had reported that Michael Cohen actually sold 4 buildings for $32 million in one day for cash, and that he was the kind of person a bank wouldn't go to. Now, if that's the kind of real estate deal that someone who is very closely connected to a real estate developer is engaged in, it does raise questions. Doesn't mean we know the answers. It does raise questions. And I want to just go back to one thing that Mr. Avenatti said earlier in response to my question, which was thuggishness. And that's why I raise that. If it is true that this helps uncover whether or not, for instance, Stephanie Clifford was threatened by someone at the direction of Michael Cohen, we don't know. But if that is a connection, then I can completely understand the relevance of trying to understand an enterprise of activity.
Right, and that's something that the feds, and now we see for the first time officially a state prosecutor is involved with, is trying to figure out if everyone's acting like gangsters, is that because they're gangsters? Michael Avenatti, thank you for phoning in on a busy news night. I appreciate you taking your views to the beat. Ambrosio Rodriguez and Maya Wiley, very appreciative. Matt Miller, stay with me.